Hello and welcome to today's COVID-19 update webinar. This is a webinar presented by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association, and it is produced by your on-the-ground Washington team, the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, and the Franklin Partnership. This is our 22nd webinar in this series since when we first began on March 20th of 2020. Lots has changed and probably too much remains the same. But we have another update for you here, and so thank you everybody for joining. I think you know us well, but I'll take a second to let you know the folks on this call. I'm Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. We're based in DC. We do public affairs and strategic communications. My colleague Paul Nathanson works with me for NTMA and PMA. He is not on today's call, but is usually on this call and spends a lot of time working on this project. We work in collaboration with the folks at the Franklin Partnership. That's Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik, both of whom are on today's call. They're your on-the-ground lobbying firm representing small and medium-sized manufacturers here in DC. A quick thing to cover before we get started when we talk about the latest in COVID relief efforts. We know that COVID relief is a priority. These are a couple of the survey results from the annual One Voice member survey. There are a number of results that are interesting and not all COVID specific, and we will be sharing those with all of you and on the social media accounts for One Voice and through other platforms. But to bring your attention to these two in particular, one thing that we always ask One Voice members is what your top priorities are for the year. And we see that number one is tax policies, tax issues. That does always rank at the top. But number two this year is COVID relief. And I think that really brings into focus how important this topic is for all of our members. And of course, that makes sense given the impact that it's had on the industry and on all of you. So rest assured, we will remain focused on this effort and keeping you all up to date with what's available in terms of COVID policy and COVID relief efforts. Also, 65% of One Voice members are tuning in to this COVID webinar on Fridays. We're hosting them about every other Friday. Was weekly, we've gone every other week, and we do change that schedule based on needs. So a lot of you are tuning in, so thank you for continuing to tune in. 100% of folks who tune in say that they find this helpful. We will certainly try to keep that up as well. And also please do check out our onevoiceinfo.org website. Look to see that website in the next few days, in the coming week, will be updated. We've got a lot of information on there, some information that is changing over time, so we'll be cleaning some stuff up, changing some things out, but some constants there. You can always find recordings of these webinars. You can find the slides and the audio as well. You can also find a link to all of the tools and resources that are typically referenced in these webinars, so do check that out. And again, like I said, we will be simplifying that site and cleaning it up to make it even easier for folks to use. And then also, please do subscribe to our podcast. So when we're not here doing the webinar, we are putting out episodes of the podcast. Our podcast is called Talking with One Voice. The folks on this call are the hosts of that podcast, and we cover issues, not just COVID relief, but also a wide range of industry issues. You can find it wherever you get your podcast. We do have a lot of listeners, about as many folks who tune into this weekly podcast also, who turn into the webinar also download the podcast. So do find us there, find your colleagues there, and I hope you'll stay a part of the discussion. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John. As you can see, the agenda is quite fulsome. There's lots to cover, so I'm going to turn it over to you, John, so that you can walk people through what you and Omar plan to discuss today.
Well, thanks, Caitlin, and let's get started. Happy New Year, everybody. It has been a while, a little bit since we've had one of these webinars, so we have a lot to go over. And like onevoiceinfo.org is being updated, like Caitlin said, the CDC has updated their webpage, and we're going to talk about they're frequently asked questions about ventilation in the workplace and what manufacturers should be looking at. We're also going to spend some time talking about, so now vaccines are starting to be, we're starting to put shots in the arm. And so the Washington Post did a vaccine tracker. We'll talk to you about that. There was, with the passage of the recent Relief Act, there is extension to some of the leave provisions in the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act. As part of that, they extended the $300 a week unemployment benefits. We'll update you on that. And they included some changes to the employer retention tax credit. The IRS finally revoked their rule that prevented the deductibility of expenses for PPP loans. So we'll update you on that. We'll talk to you about the relaunch of the PPP program. There's the PPP-1 and PPP-2, the second draw program. We'll mention that, and then we'll move on to talk about what is the next steps legislatively moving forward. So what did the CDC do? The CDC said ventilation is extremely important in the workforce, in the workplace. And so they encouraged people to run your ventilation systems at maximum capacity for safety. And it's not just when your employees are in the workforce, in the workplace, but even when they're outside of the workplace. So maintain high airflow throughout the facility. Make sure your filters are clean. That seems to be obvious. But it also mentions, for example, making sure the filters in the restrooms are cleaned. And so those are just some key tips that the CDC put forward in their recently frequently asked questions. Then on the vaccine front, as many of you know, there's 2 vaccines right now that have been launched, and more are coming online very shortly. The key provision in the vaccine issue, it's not necessarily in these first 2 that have been approved. You need 2 shots, and so you need an initial dose, and then you need to come back. I think it's 22 days later for your second vaccination. And so the Washington Post did a survey of how are we doing across the country at doing that second vaccine moving forward. And that is a big concern with medical professionals, that many people will only go for that initial shot and won't come back for that second shot. And here, the Washington Post shows some of those states that have done a pretty good job of making sure that the patients are coming back for that second shot, folks in Illinois, Connecticut, and Tennessee. But if you live in Utah, Indiana, or New Hampshire, the state is not doing a good job of tracking those people who receive that initial vaccine to make sure they come back for that second shot. Omar, with the passage of the stimulus bill, there was some changes and extensions on some of the leave provisions.
That's right. And in here, we're referring to the emergency paid sick leave and the FFCRA, as I believe most of you now, especially in HR world, it's been ingrained in you. What Congress did in this bill that they passed and the president signed a few weeks ago is, if you as the employee still had not used all of your 80 hours that was provided for, you were then, if the employer extended the voluntary program, permitted to continue using up to those 80 hours through March 31st. Again, so long as the employer chose to participate in this voluntary program, extending the FFCRA from January 1st, 2021 through March 31st, 2021. The employer could also continue to claim the credits for the reimbursement for that employee retention that was done there. Here are a couple of things that clarify in case the employer is not, for example, extending voluntarily the FFCRA if you did not use that. Again, the employer is not required to provide the FFCRA leave after December 31st, but they may voluntarily decide to do so. So that's important to take a look at that in terms of the context of using your 80 hours. And that's the FAQ that you're seeing here that they released on New Year's Eve. That's number 104. You'll take a look at the link below. Since this, they have not issued any other FFCRA updates as of yesterday, and prior to this, they had not issued any updates for some time, I believe since September. So these are the most significant that you'll see on both the left that deal with your 80 hours, and then also on the sick leave care for the family medical that's on there as well. So it's important that you obviously discuss first at the employer level, what is the decision, which you may have already made, whether or not to extend it through March 31st, but also these are the new guidance and requirements that they're putting out there. Again, it does not start the clock over on the calendar year to accrue a new 80 hours. It's only for those that did not exhaust their 80 hours in 2020. And that's an important clarification that probably has already some employees confused and that way you can tell them, look, not my rule, it's the government's rule. Speaking of unemployment, though, and John, jump in here because I know this was a point of contention for a lot of our members and also for those on Capitol Hill. But John, what they did, and there was talk maybe going up to $600 extension of the federal unemployment subsidy. But John, they ended up at $300, but they did put additional return to work reporting requirements.
Yeah, so they extended the $300 weekly unemployment benefits through March 14th. So that's a critical date that you keep in mind for the passage of some future stimulus package, which we'll talk about later in this presentation. But they did insist on some return to work requirements. And so each state is now going to be required to establish a site where employers can report potential employees or potential workers who have turned down work and who wanted to maintain, these unemployment benefits. And so this was a provision sought by the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady. We have heard anecdotal information from some One Voice members that, hey, people aren't returning to work because of the unemployment, because of their receiving this extended unemployment. And so this is basically an effort to put rubber to the road to see, let's see how many people are out there who have turned down, going back to work because of the extension of unemployment benefits.
That's right. Speaking of retention of employees, as we discussed under FFCRA, John and I and your team here in Washington lobbied quite hard with the support of a great PR team in an effort to work on the employee retention tax credit. We'll refer to it as the ERTC. Many of you recall the government was providing you support and effectively reimbursing up to 50% for eligible employees, which ended up being around $5,000 per employee for you keeping them on payroll. However, what they did is they said if you were receiving a PPP loan that was being forgiven, you were barred from claiming the ERTC. What we and other lobbying groups worked on was expanding that, and most importantly, start reading this inverse from the bottom up. You are permitted, if you have a PPP loan that is being forgiven or has been, you are now permitted to claim the ERTC. The double dipping prevention effectively means that if you had an employee's salary who was fully forgiven under your PPP loan, then no, you may not also go ahead and claim the ERTC because you didn't pay their salary. The ones that paid it was the federal government. It's also important to note that they did also increase it. So the maximum percentage claimed is now quite a bit. You can go up to 70% of $40,000 as you look into how you do it per quarter. And again, it's important to look at the timeline because some of the enhanced ERTC is now more for the starting of the calendar year 2021. It's important to discuss with your accountant whether or not this still does apply to you, especially moving forward. This really could bring a lot of money back onto the table from many of the companies that we had heard previously using it. But I just mentioned, John, the issue of double dipping down here at the bottom of this slide. The issue of double dipping when it came down to the IRS notice on the deduction of PPP expenses caused a bit of a stir for many of our members.
Yeah, and IRS's view under the current administration was if you're getting a forgiven PPP loan, you should not be able to deduct the expenses of it. Well, that was clearly not the intent of Congress, and this was one of our top legislative priorities as Congress considered the recent stimulus bill that was signed into law. And as a result, we were successful in getting 3 of the 4 top tax writers to support the legislation to change the IRS rule on it. And they recently came out with a revision of it, which they revoked their previous view that you could not deduct expenses if you received a PPP loan. So this is a huge victory for One Voice moving forward.
It really is, John. And what we all looked at it, we said this is potentially a 37% tax hit for our manufacturers. That when we created and lobbied the PPP, we were told that no, you don't have to pay anything on this. And so it is really significant, the victory that we were able to secure. So this is your official. Don't take our word for it. It's on the screen. It's come from the IRS. It obsolete this updated notice that came out before Christmas. IRS notice 2020-32 no longer exists. So if you have a loan that is forgiven or anticipated to be forgiven, as John mentioned, you are good to go. We don't want to spend too much time on the first draw of PPP loans that are fully reopening on Monday. Lenders can fully reopen the portal today after it being open to a limited segment starting on Monday and then Wednesday. The reason we don't want to spend as much time here on PPP1 is in large part because our surveys have told us that 86% of you have already taken a PPP loan. So for the most part, we're just going to highlight a couple of key changes here if we could. One is that you do have a couple of areas where now in the forgiveness, the covered period is between 8 and 24 weeks. It's no longer an or, and it's not an ending December 31 of 2020. So now you can choose the 12, the 13, the 14 weeks, as many of you had discussed with us individually offline over last summer. So that's important to take a look at. And then there's also some additional expenses that have been put in there. So again, how to apply for a loan. Most of you have already been through this process, so we will not fully run through this too much, but it's important to know if you have not secured a PPP1 loan that you have until March 31st of this year in order to do so. All first draw loans pretty much have the exact same term, regardless of the lender or borrower, and so that has not changed. That's out there. So if you have not received loan forgiveness, we have received this question because there's some changes that we're going to touch on in a minute here that were made. You can technically go back and reapply for loan increases, or if you return the money based on changes in the law. So as you can see, you can go ahead. And so if you have not had your loan forgiveness done, you can go and say, well, I left some money on the table based on the new calculations and eligible costs, and therefore I'm deciding to change it. And so your questions are, what are those changes? We highlighted below some of the key identifications. Obviously, you'll see right here, 501c6 organizations, your associations, both of these two are now eligible for this loan. But for your purposes, covered supplier costs and covered worker expenditures. John, that was a big deal. I know, especially for Susan Collins there. Before you jump in on the PPE side of it, this covered supplier cost that you see here, we believe, and we've been told that this would cover the items such as steel and aluminum and other raw materials, and also potentially also help out for payments to you from your customers that claim it. But John, also the PPE side of it has been pretty significant.
Yeah, and as part of that is they gave a list of areas that would be covered under the PPE, personal protective equipment, and that would be ventilation, screening, health screening of your employees and such. And so those would be eligible costs moving forward. Purchasing of gowns and stuff is part of your PPE. That would be included as eligible costs to be considered as part of your expenses of the PPP loan. Keep in mind, the percentage remains the same, 60-40. 60% of the loan must be used on maintaining payroll with 40% for expenses, but we were successful, to Omar's point, to perhaps allow those contracts that you had that were established outside of the covered period of the loan. That would be covered expense, your steel and aluminum expenses, but also supplier costs and PPE.
And so here's that language that John just touched on, and we skipped over the previous two slides. We already told you pick your 8 weeks to 24-week period, so that's all in there. We've already told you in the past you have 10 months from the end of your covered period to submit for forgiveness, so that's not new. This is new. What John just mentioned, it's important. So there's two things that you really want to focus on. The contract being in effect prior to the covered period with respect to the covered loan. What that means, when we all spoke earlier, the language in August was prior to February 15th, you had the contract. This is even better. So if you have a contract for a supplier purchase, you now have to look, when did my covered period begin? Was it April 17th, April 4th, like it was for many of you? And start looking at what, again, that's only if you have not submitted forgiveness yet, or if you want to reapply. But please keep in mind that these eligible supplier costs, just as what John ran through all of these right here on PPE, also apply to the second draw. So as you are going through this and saying, well, I've already submitted, I'm not opening up that can of worms. If you are considering a second draw, and we'll touch on that in just a couple slides, please now note that these changes on PPP1, such as what John ran through here in the previous steel aluminum, now apply there as well. And so the new rules apply to all PPP1 loans that are not forgiven. So that's something that you definitely want to consider it with your CPA and also with your CFO, whether or not you do want to take a look at. But once the PPP loans have been closed, then obviously you're not going to be able to go back in and retroactively be able to undo that. I think most of you are really more focused on the second one. The last item, just want to clarify here on an FAQ before we just jump over in on who may reapply. But if a partnership received a loan that did not include compensation for its partners, can the loan amount be increased to include partner compensation? This is not to many of you, but there were a few companies in the summer that said, well, the 100,000 issue makes me nervous, so I'm not going to include some of the principal owners, and therefore they only included the employees. Well, this clarifies for those that do choose to go back in or to apply this rule onto the second round that's out there. So again, we've already run through who may reapply for PPP1, but John, I think second draw, that's been pretty much the same terms as we've talked about here on PPP1.
Yes, you know, and you know, it's a 5-year loan. It's you know, no additional documentation. They're trying to make a seamless transition from borrowers to go from a PP1 to a PPP2. Many of the changes that they've made in implementation of the PPP2, they've incorporated, as we mentioned, in the PPP1 program to sort of make this a seamless transition of all of the programs that were put forth in the several stimulus packages that the Congress considered over the past year. The PPP program had strong bipartisan support, largely because it was a seamless transition for not only the government, but the lenders, the bankers, the borrowers, and consumers moving forward to make sure that we are maintaining payroll.
That's right. So let's just jump into where you are. Similar to the PPP1, as of right now, and John and I will touch on legislation and where we stand on Capitol Hill in a little bit, but as of right now, both PPP1 and second draw, that's the terminology for a second PPP loan here in town. Second draw open until March 31st. Do not wait until the 30th. Remember the portal issues last time. Key differences that we've highlighted for you for between PPP1 and second draw. These are virtually the only major changes, but they are critical as they likely will exclude a good number of our members. Has no more than 300 employees. This is not subject to NAICS, such as last time where we had automotive stampers that were permitted by the SBA, since they consider small business, to 1,000 employees. There is not an or in here in that size standard, it's an and in the statute. So therefore you are 300 employees and you do it the head count. They are doing the affiliation rules they have are still out there as well. So it is important. We just received a question with regards to the 300 employee count is global and not just the US. And that is correct. We don't believe they did do a clarification referring back to their previous affiliation rules and believe in the new IFR that you can get on this link. Well, actually you go to the previous ones on PPP1, you will see affiliation. So that is correct. You do have to factor in your normal affiliations if you've got other companies associated and your global count. It is not just the United States again. So be very careful on your 300 head count. You do not have an out under your NAICS unless you're NAICS 72, which none of you are. You must demonstrate, and this is important, and we've got a couple of things here on the revenue loss tests in the next couple of slides. John and I aren't the CPA, so just pass these next 3 slides on, you're smart people. You have to demonstrate a 25% revenue, or 25% reduction in gross receipts using comparable quarters. So meaning second quarter of 2020, compare that to second quarter of 2019. You do have the option, if you would like, to compare the entire calendar year of 2020 to the entire calendar year of 2019, but just to simplify paperwork if you had all of that. But IRS believes, Treasury has stated, they believe the vast majority of you will do a quarter over a quarter selection. Again, the maximum loan amount, that remains the same. Nothing has changed there, but it's important to take a look at this here in terms of the revenue loss test. Here's the new second draw application. You'll see covered supplier costs and covered PPE that John described still remains there as well. You will also see how they have the reference quarter of 2019 and the 2020 quarter reference. Now, again, if we get into here, I know we're starting to get the clarification on receipts, and this is why we're not CPAs and why we copy and paste. Here is the actual language. There's some other nonsense in between, so we just consolidated the relevant points. This is from the interim final rule that applies to the second draw of PPP that was just posted last week from the Treasury Department and SBA. So a borrower must calculate the revenue reduction by comparing the quarterly. You've heard that corresponding. So again, they look at the gross receipts. They specified that the forgiveness also the borrower received in the calendar is excluded from the borrower's gross receipts. Documentation, they want tax forms, annual tax forms, if relevant, quarterly statements, other bank statements as well. Here is the actual part on gross definition of gross receipts to my California friend that is laughing at my CPA abilities. Gross receipts includes all revenue in whatever form received or accrued from whatever source, including the sales of products, services, interest, dividends, rents, royalties, fees, commissions, reduced by returns, allowances. I'm not going to read this all again. Make sure you take this slide. These are the definitions that they have used. We've gone through the 82, 84 page IFR, or this one's only 40 pages. So this is the reference that we've seen. Now I know from the CPA side, we're probably going to get additional questions, which means we're hopefully going to see additional guidance. I'll stop here because we did get one question before I turn it back over to John here. The PPP2 funds, can they be used to pay additional items? Is the loan amount still determined by payroll costs only? The loan amount is still determined by 2.5 times the payroll that you use. You may use either the average annual of 2019 or the average annual of 2020. When you take a look at the expenditures that are permitted under eligible costs that John wisely pointed out at 60-40 ratio, the eligible expenses is still the same. So your non-payroll costs that we discussed, such as suppliers, rent, utilities, etc., those are eligible costs under the second draw up to 40%, not to exceed 40%. So it is not payroll only, but the loan amount, again, is the same as PP1 determined by that. And this is where we reference into the prior year or not. But John, on forgiveness, right now, we think you, on first round, you most likely should have been up and running. But before we get to that, Caitlin, now that we've gone through a little bit here on PPP2 and second draw and given an overview, Caitlin, do you want to launch a poll to see what folks think of it? Would they be interested? And then John, maybe you can walk us through some of the next steps after that. Caitlin?
Sure. So you should all see a poll on your screen. Now, having received more information through this webinar on the PPP second draw loans, will you? And then there's a number of options to select. Give you a little bit here to respond, but I see the responses coming in.
Yeah, believe it or not, as Caitlin's going to wrap it here in a second, the terms of the PPP, the 25% revenue loss test is actually a lot better than where we started. We started this, John, at 50%,
50,
dropped
right.
down to 35, right? And so we knew they were going to have something in here. Now, we did also receive a question earlier today with regards to certification of a needs test, and do you need it? Well, I think one could argue that if you meet the 25% revenue loss test, you're already meeting that certification needs down there. But Caitlin, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. So it's been about a minute. Thank you to all of you who responded. Almost everybody on today's webinar responded. So thank you very much. Overwhelming majority consensus, guys, is that that first answer, request a second PPP loan.
Thank you, Caitlin. That's good to know. That is fairly consistent. When we had our last survey, we were hovering around 72%, and now that we've got a little bit out there, and I think that's really helpful. So I appreciate all of you that have responded to that. And this, again, really summarizes those previous slides that we've talked about, the 25% revenue loss test, the second draw being capped at 2 million or 2.5% of the monthly average of 2019 or 2020 payroll. So many of these, just a quick summary recap, but we strongly do encourage you, take some of these slides out there. If we do have additional guidance receiving on the gross receipts test, we certainly will be able to pass those along immediately. But John, why don't we start transitioning over here to next steps and where we think some things might be heading with Capitol Hill?
Well, we are still waiting for additional guidance from SBA and Treasury. We are looking for some clarification from the IRS on the ERTC, the Employee Retention Tax Credit. There is continuing growing opposition within the Congress of what the Treasury has done on Form 3509, which is requiring an additional necessity test. And so we believe in a future stimulus bill that the Biden administration is going to put forward, that there potentially could be a repeal of that necessity test. Having said that, the president just last night announced his goals and policy positions on what his new stimulus package would be. It's roughly $1.9 trillion, but we'll go into more detail. It was just released late last night, and we will provide additional information moving forward. But the goal, though, is President-elect Biden is going to try to pass a bipartisan stimulus bill using regular order. There is regular order where you need 60 votes, and the president is hopeful that he will be able to get, with the Senate being tied at 50-50, 10 Republicans to sign on to his stimulus proposal. The alternative is to force the Senate to go through a reconciliation process where it doesn't allow non-discretionary spending or discretionary spending to be included in it. You only need 51 votes. I'm really getting into the weeds here. Biden's goal is going to try to do this for regular order. We think he wants to hold the reconciliation where he only needs 51 votes when he wants to make some changes in healthcare and in tax policy. That's where he'll want to use that reconciliation provision, which is an arcane provision in the Senate where they can pass legislation by avoiding the filibuster. So. What do you think, Omar? Does it get done? And when does it get done?
That's a good question, John, because our understanding, and not to get into what the president-elect put out last night, our understanding is he would like to try to move a bipartisan COVID bill that secures the 60 Senate votes without having to go through reconciliation, which doesn't permit the spending of discretionary funds through that process, which would hamper their efforts. So what we are hearing is that he does want to take a go at it. It's not going to be the 1.9 trillion that he released, why we're not going to spend much time on. A lot of those are giveaways and political posturing. But there are some important things that will become law that are in there, but he would likely need those Senate Republican votes. And the question is, would they go along with it? The timing we understand is they are going to move forward pretty quickly on things they've already drafted up. They are going to try to move forward pretty quickly on some OSHA standards through emergency procedures, but they know that those cannot be permanent. So they are calling on Congress to move forward with some additional requirements under OSHA in workplace. John, I think that you are looking at a pretty quick introduction. I do believe, and from what we're hearing here in DC, that the frameworks that they sent out yesterday, it's pretty detailed and lengthy for a summary. So the legislative language probably isn't far behind. We think we could see movement towards the end of the month, early February on draft bill. But John, you pointed out that March 14 deadline, and that's important. That's the last day that Congress starts to look at on their calendar, and then they leave permanently on March 26th, the last day of House votes before Easter. So that's really the deadline, John, that I'm personally looking at when you combine it with the March 31st FFCRA. Let's look at March 26th, that Friday.
Yeah, I agree with you. The way the Congress teed up the recent relief bill that was just passed, they put those deadlines in essentially to force that new administration to submit their proposal and give Congress the necessary time to pass another stimulus package moving forward. And so with the expiration of the unemployment benefits on the 14th, the expiration of other provisions on the 31st of the month, I think we're looking at, potentially a bill becoming law sometime end of February, early March. Having said that, there's a lot on the plate of the Congress and the Senate. You've got Senate cabinet secretaries up for confirmation. That's going to take a lot of time. Who knows what's going to happen if there's going to be impeachment proceedings, and there's many other things that need to be addressed in the United States Senate. So we just wonder whether there's enough bandwidth, but we do believe this is President Biden's top priority, is to move an additional bipartisan stimulus bill moving forward.
It is, but Caitlin, we hear about workforce in our survey, and even during COVID, our survey that I'm looking at now of January here shows that 86% of our members have skilled positions that are open, and over 90%, 95% have serious or moderate challenges recruiting qualified workers.
That's right. And that is something that we are still trying to shine a light on, particularly as manufacturers face the double or sometimes triple pressure of trying to find workers and cope with the pandemic and other financial implications. So that's reflected also in the number of media inquiries that we get. So here's one recently did. It features a PMA member sharing their experience, a very good story in the Wall Street Journal. I will flag for you as well that that's not the only kind of media inquiry that we are getting. I think you guys will be not surprised to know that we are also getting a lot of media inquiries from reporters who want to talk about steel supply. So the media is very interested in the issues of raw material shortages and price spikes. So if that's you on this call, you can speak to that issue. Please do connect with me or with Paul Nathanson, who can hook you up with those media opportunities. We typically get inquiries from top national publications as well as top regional publications and trade publications. So we appreciate anybody who volunteers for those opportunities, and it is, of course, also an opportunity to raise the profile of your business and of course of our associations as well. So thanks for the time on that.
Yep. And John, you know, we just talked about this the other day, is how to make sure that the associations remain here. And Caitlin, you showed that survey results that showed how many folks found these webinars useful, John.
Yeah, and you know, as we wrap up, if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask the question in the panel on the right-hand side. But the support of the membership of the work that's being done, the advocacy work, the communications work being done by the Policy Resolution Group with Caitlin and Paul is extremely important. And you know, if you like to see that these programs are continued, that these communications and updating that website, and because you know, just because it's a new president, there's still going to be a lot of changes, and we believe this is important to the membership that we keep them updated with these bi-monthly webinars and more if it's necessary. And so, if you believe these sessions are important, I hope you will dig deep and consider making a contribution to NTMA's GAF, their advocacy fund, and PMA's advocacy fund as well. So there are links here on this page where you can make a contribution. This is a program that accepts corporate contributions, unlike other provisions that require a personal contribution. This is extremely important if we are going to continue to maintain the high quality of services that, quite candidly, you expect and you deserve. So thank you in advance for your contribution this year.
Thank you, John. Let's run through a few of the questions that we have remaining that we did not already address. And what is the allotted time in order to file for forgiveness of PPP1? Number of months. It is 10 months from the conclusion of your covered period. So if you choose 14 weeks, 15 weeks, be careful and make sure you recall which months have 30 days and which months have 31, so you are not off by several days. That is something that definitely is going to catch some people. So settle with your lender on what is the most appropriate timing in order to submit. It is 10 months. So those are some things that you can address there. Another question that we just received. We received a first draw of PPP loan in 2020. We plan to apply for the second draw and comply with the 300 employees using all and the 25% or more gross reduction in the same quarter. A couple of questions here. Are these all of the criteria in the second draw? And does the economic uncertainty make loan necessity language also apply? So a couple of things here, and let me also answer the quarterly question at the same time that came in, and we'll start with that one. People are asked, is it my quarters of my fiscal year or is it calendar? We'll double check with CPAs. Everything that we've seen so far treats the quarterly as a calendar quarterly, and we believe all the lenders are applying a calendar quarterly as well. If that is not the case, we will reach out to that individual, but everything we've seen tells us that it is a calendar quarter so far, but we will make sure to double check that. So that goes to the questions with regards to the criteria. All of the criteria that we have seen so far, there's a few others, but the main that will apply to you all will be that 300 and the 25%. Going to the economic uncertainty and the making the loan necessary, we know that CPAs have gone back and forth, and some of the more conservative organizations have felt that they cannot in good faith make that determination declaratory statement. That's again up to the individual to talk to their lender and their counsel if they so choose. But the CPAs for which we've been speaking, a 25% revenue loss seems to indicate you would meet that needs test. We will continue to see if they provide us additional guidance, because we know that is something that folks were concerned about earlier on. But we also have not seen any instances of the Treasury or SBA trying to claw it back a loan based on this. Again, many forgiveness has already been processed. So if you all have seen a case, please let me know, because I've not seen one where they're clawing it back based on that particular provision. But yes, we will definitely continue to watch that very, very, very closely. Is the PPP2, is the second draw SBA portal actually open now? I have not been able to confirm that. Did it open today? There were 3 key dates, January 11th, 13th, 15th, the 11th being for working with the underserved community banks, and those lenders were allowed to start moving forward pretty quickly on the 11th, and then also some of the second draw on the 13th. The system is now open today, technically, for all lenders to start going into the portal, and they will be able to accept and process loans starting on Tuesday, January 19th, with Monday being a federal holiday. So our understanding is, based on the notice that was put on the evening of the 13th by the SBA, they put it out, Tuesday is your day when everyone is fully open, but the lender should be able to go in today, at some point today, theoretically, and start taking a look at that as well. That's just some of the gross receipts. We had a couple of other in there. We're hesitant to go in and speculate much beyond the language that we've already posted here on this presentation that will be made available on the website on onevoiceinfo.org, and also is sent out in a follow-up email from NTMA and PMA One Voice. If we do receive an additional guidance beyond what was included herein, we will certainly blast that out and also put it in a upcoming webinar as well. A couple of other areas. Sanitizing disinfectants, mass deductible through PPP. Our understanding, again, I can run back through that slide. There was a slide specific to all those that did highlight the different items. I do believe the sanitization of PPE is also included. We do know that disinfectants are also included on that list as well, and that comes from the interim final rule that is updated to implement. So we'll go ahead and say yes, but we will go ahead and verify that, but believe without going back 7 or 8 slides, that is covered in there as well.
Omar, I don't think masks are, shields are, but I'm not sure masks are covered as PPE.
Yeah, I think you've got a couple of areas where they've got the face coverings that you can look at. So things that are purchased by the employer. So if you want, we can go back and take a look at some of these that are on here and where we are. There we go. PPE expenses, covered materials. So if you go under this code of federal regulations, and then you go under the NIOSH. So many of these that are approved for emergency use only, here's some of your face coverings that come on here. So this is where you go into the NIOSH standards. So some of you that actually have been using these for years because of for the respiratory protection. There's also now some that have been approved for emergency use, and those also can be provided and paid for under PPE. Some of them are intended for hospital use, but again, many of you are buying some of those, so that will be able to go in there as well. But as you can see, some of the barriers that are on here, and especially tied into some of the ventilation CDC requirements that they put out there. Give folks another second or so, and we're a little past half the hour. Based on popular demand, we're probably going to try to do these more frequently than once a month, depending again on what Caitlin said on need and what we're hearing from Capitol Hill. So either expect one from us either in the next 2 weeks or 3, depending on how things are proceeding up on Capitol Hill. We did receive one question, somewhat obviously related to COVID, but with regards, many of you are aware that as part of your One Voice membership for many years, we've hosted an in-person visit to Washington, D.C. at what we call our legislative fly-in conference. Obviously, we had to cancel it last year due to COVID. It's unclear whether or not one will be able to happen in person this year. Even under COVID, there were quite a few restrictions. And then following the events of last week, you have to be escorted by a member of Congress, not a staffer at this point, to be able to go through the Capitol. So it's unclear right now whether or not it's going, but we did have a planning meeting earlier in the week to discuss that, and we will let members know if that is an opportunity. In the interim, please look out for notices from NTMA and PMA with regards to virtual fly-ins. We conducted 16 of them in September and October and gave our members an opportunity to meet with their senators and representatives online through Zoom. And John, we thought those were a very effective way to bring Congress to you instead of you all the way to Washington.
Absolutely, and that was reflected in the survey data, which once again, I want to thank you for those who have completed that survey, because that data is so critically important. And and so we're going to be looking at perhaps initiating these virtual fly-ins sometime early this spring, so that members can continue to touch and have a discussion and have a dialogue with their senators and members of Congress, because that's critically important as we continue to be advocating on your behalf on so many of these important issues. They need to hear from you. You don't need to know necessarily the details of the legislation, but those policymakers need to know the challenges that you face, whether it's dealing with the COVID issue or dealing with some of the workforce challenges that you have to deal with during this COVID and restricted work environment.
Okay. With that, we're now at quarter till. Please, if any questions, you know how to reach us. Stay tuned for further information. Appreciate anything you can do to continue supporting your associations, because these webinars are not made possible without the donations and contributions like people like you all. Thanks again, everyone. Appreciate your time today.